You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi everyone, welcome back to Nutrition Matters. My name is Paige and I'm your host, and I'm excited to share this conversation I had with Cara Harbstreet. She is a powerhouse person and I just enjoy her perspective and her thoughts so much. She's very thoughtful, and I was really excited to dive into kind of how she found that really powerful, authentic voice that she has. And so that's what we talk about today in today's episode. We also talk about what that means for the everyday average person who's listening. You might not be in a place of communicating nutrition messaging in a book or on a podcast or in a really public way, but maybe what does it look like in the everyday one-on-one interactions? How do you find your authentic voice there? So I'm really just excited to share this with you. I really enjoy Cara. She's a really fabulous dietitian and a great communicator. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I will remind you that there is, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can support at $5 a month and receive a lot of extra good stuff. So you'll get access to the supporter only podcast called Nutrition Matters Premium. And every month I record a lesson, I record a Q&A episode, and then I also record a guided meditation. This last week, I recorded a lesson about meal planning. I talk about kind of how do you find a balance where you plan and have somewhat of an idea of what you're going to eat and what you're going to need from the store without it being a diety endeavor. So that's something I'm really passionate about, is kind of exploring kind of where diet culture doesn't get to own some of these things that actually can be helpful and can make our lives easier, and how do we find the balance there. So if you're interested, click the link in the show notes here and you can support the podcast at $5 a month, and you'll get access to all the previous episodes and all upcoming episodes as well. So with that, let's get into talking with Cara Harbstreet all about finding your authentic voice. Hi, Cara. Welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, so take a minute, Cara, and talk about who you are and what you do. Introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Well, I'm super excited to be here. I am also a dietitian, and it's always really exciting to get a chance to share my story and the work that I do. So I am currently working, I guess, somewhat in private practice, but my path to this point has been a little bit twisted, you could say. I did a pretty traditional undergrad program. I went on to do my internship and master's in Kansas City, which is the area I grew up in. And when I first started working as a dietitian, I was more in the corporate wellness space. So we were doing a lot of wellness programming and business-to-business services for some of the companies that are in the metro area. And I really liked that work because it let me do a lot of creative things. And, there was no such thing as a routine. So a ton of variety as far as the types of people that I was counseling, and a lot of culinary focus too. So a lot of really good things there. But unfortunately, after about a year and a half, that ended, and I was left kind of wondering, okay, like, what's my next move? My plans changed pretty quickly. So around that time, I was starting to be more active in the blogging world, and I had my social media up and running, and I started to connect to a lot of really interesting dietitians who were doing work that I didn't really know about before. Like I said, it was a really traditional program, so I didn't get a lot of training as far as how to approach private practice or bring that aspect of entrepreneurship into my career. So at that point, this was about 2016, I took the dive and started up a side hustle and tried to grow that for about the next year while I was still working a clinical position. And then at that point realized, like, okay, this is kind of where I feel like I belong. I think I'm going to go for it. And ever since then, I've been doing a combination of a lot of different things. But as of this point in time, I'm not doing as much counseling as I once was. And my work has really shifted to be more in that media and communications space. So working with a few different brand partners, working on some consulting projects, doing a lot of writing. And yeah, every day is still pretty different. So I feel like this is a good spot for me right now.
You're also the author of a book.
Yes. Like I said, lots and lots of writing.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I was in school as a really young kid, reading was always something I loved doing. I always had a book with me. And in my head, it was sort of this aspirational idea, like maybe someday I'll have a book of my own. And yeah, I mean, this last year has been really, really busy, but the book projects have been so, so fun. Just another really creative way to get messages out there that reflect how I personally and professionally feel about food and nutrition. So it's been great to have that additional platform to put that out there in the world.
Yeah, that's so amazing, and what a huge honor. And that's interesting to hear about, like, how when you were a kid holding your books and thinking like, okay, maybe one day I'll have a book of my own. I'm interested to hear kind of like, have you always liked writing, or has that evolved throughout the years? And where that's coming from is I used to hate writing personally, and now I think it's one of the coolest ways to connect to how I feel about something and to really solidify my current thoughts that, I have permission to evolve and change. But I've found it's actually just really therapeutic and really a really important part of my work as well. So I'm interested to know, has that evolved for you?
No, totally. And I completely agree with you about that therapeutic aspect, because I think it's just been, at least for me, a really nice way to process these thoughts. In the work that we do as non-diet dietitians, we've been trained in one way, and we really have to challenge that. We're doing a lot of unlearning and relearning and rephrasing. And it's not only been a really good way for me to process this new information and bounce it off the wall a few times to see how it lands for me, but then also it's been really insightful to see how my writing has changed over the years. I mean, going back to school, I would say that was probably one of my stronger subjects. I always seemed to do well on assignments that involved writing or some kind of creative aspect with language, more so than maybe math or science. So that was always nice to have that strength there. But going through our education as well, a lot of that style of writing is very formal, and you get into a master's program, you're reading tons of literature about different study protocols, and maybe you're even involved in research yourself, and it can feel really rigid. Like there's just no opportunity to highlight the nuance or bring your own personal opinions or commentary into the writing. And so when I found that was no longer this restriction that I had, blogging was a really cool way to explore that, because my platform was my own again. I could really just say whatever I was thinking about. I could pursue the things that I was most interested in. And with the evolution into some of the platforms now, I think it's a really powerful way to put this out there. Not everyone wants to listen to a podcast. Not everyone wants to watch a documentary or listen to interviews and things like that. So I think it's just a nice way to offer the same, type of content and messaging for people who want to process it a little bit differently, or really who just enjoy language and really like to read, because I consider myself one of those people. And I just, any spare moment I have trying to read something new, learn something new. And yeah, being able to contribute back to that, I think is a really big honor. And like you said, such a privilege.
Yeah, that's so amazing. So tell me about kind of how did you find the non-diet space? Was that always something that you subscribed to, or is there a story there? Is there a process that you went through to kind of develop your own philosophy or your own voice with this?
Yeah, I think it was a very long, very slow, and often unconscious process, we'll say, because, in school and even very early in my career, counseling clients for the first time and gaining more confidence in that realm, I think I always maybe gravitated towards those messages that felt more inclusive and less restrictive, because I would catch myself saying things that, now sitting where I am today, I still think like, oh, wow, that's still pretty problematic. But even at the time, I was looking for ways to encourage people to add things in versus taking them out of their eating pattern, or, looking for ways to create sustainable habits that weren't so restrictive or didn't include deprivation or dieting. So I think the seed was always there, but because of that very traditional education, I wasn't seeing any other examples of how that could go another step further and take it fully into intuitive eating and a health at every size approach. And that was, again, kind of overlapping with the time where I was being more active on social media and discovering some of these dietitians who were doing that work and had been doing that work for a very long time. And I remember at one point I went back through like my Amazon order history, and I was curious to see when I actually purchased the book Intuitive Eating for the first time. And it was so funny to me because I think that was back in like 2014 or 2015. I think it was maybe right when I was wrapping up my internship, or sort of around the time I was finishing my master's. And I would have said that at that point, I was maybe at the height of my own really disordered patterns and associations with food and exercise. And it was so ironic to me that I purchased the book that long ago, but some of this stuff didn't really sink in until years later. So there was no true light bulb moment or like the flip of a switch that brought me across the line into a non-diet approach. But through that evolution of stepping back a little bit and having a chance to work in counseling that wasn't so fixated on a weight-centric approach, I think that was when it really started to click. And since then, just haven't looked back.
That's awesome. That's interesting to hear. I didn't know that part of your story. So when I think of you, Cara, I think of somebody who is really good with words. Really, you come off very strong, very confident, very unapologetic, and I mean those in really like in very complimentary ways. Like I admire that about you, and I think that that's just something that draws at least me to you and what I love about you. And I also know that sometimes the way that we, like our persona online or wherever, sometimes is kind of different than the way we feel when we're by ourselves or with our families. And I was just interested if there's anything interesting there that we could kind of dig into. Do you agree? Do you feel like that's part of your persona? And I don't mean persona in a negative way, but just like what people see of you when you're out in public. And in the public eye, I'm interested to kind of dig in there and see if there's anything we could discuss and explore.
Yeah, well, I first have to say, I appreciate you sharing that with me, because I often wonder, how does my brand look from the outside looking in? And of course, I'm so biased because I'm so close to it. This is like, my baby that I've had for years at this point. So I really appreciate you sharing that feedback. And I agree, there has to be a point where you start to speak with a lot more conviction on these tough topics, because when we straddle that line, it was not only confusing for me when I was doing some of that straddling myself, but as I learned more and more about the history of this movement and the social justice aspects behind it, I realized that there really wasn't a place for me to be wishy-washy with this message. It has to be black and white in some senses. And I'm sure we can dig into the nuance of this whole approach a little bit later, but at least in that regard, as far as establishing myself really firmly in the camp of this is who I am, this is what my brand is all about, this is what I believe, and this is what I won't compromise or negotiate on, I think was something that I learned somewhat early on. At that point, I had been sort of dabbling with my side hustle, but was still working a corporate job. And I made the decision to invest in working with a business coach because I was realizing that maybe this is a viable model for me, but I don't have the skills or knowledge to take it to the next level without, a little bit of help. So I made that decision. And I remember one of the pieces of advice that I got through that coaching was that when you kind of stake your claim on a message or you solidify where you are in your nutrition philosophy or how you approach your work, you run the risk of losing some people. Like that's going to be a turnoff and it's not going to resonate. It might repel some of the people who deep down would actually benefit from hearing it. And all of that coincides with the fact that it's going to have the opposite effect for another group of people. And that message and that conviction will attract them to you. And they'll realize, hey, like she's speaking exactly to me. This is a message I didn't know I needed to hear, but I love it and I'm here for it. And I think that was the realization for me that it's a double-edged sword, I should say, because, you run that risk, but at the same time, it opens a lot of opportunities and puts you in contact with the people who will really support your business and help you grow in your own learning. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges that I had to go through in the beginning. And then since then, it's been that fine balance of just like you described. You have this personal side of yourself that you're not always willing to disclose on such a public platform. And I think what people really crave sometimes is that authenticity, and they want you to be as forthcoming as possible and just give them the real talk of how things truly are. And there's always a piece of you that wants to provide that because we have this like people pleasing aspect and you're like, yes, I know that's what you want and I can give it to you. But at the same time, I've learned to be a little bit more careful about how much of my personal life I share on social media. And that also goes back to just being mindful of the privilege that we have in speaking to these topics with or without the same lived experiences as the people who are on the receiving end.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what is it like for you? Like when you and part of me is wondering on a personal level too, just because this is something that I wrestle with, like being public, being online, being like even having a podcast is not really something that that I naturally gravitate toward, or I'm like, yeah, that's what I really want to do. There's parts of it that are fun, but there's so much of it that's super, super uncomfortable for me. And I would kind of prefer to just kind of sit back and and not be so out there. So when stuff happens that feels uncomfortable or that like shows some type of flaw or some type of blind spot that I have, like I have to work through that, and it's good. It's positive. It's helping me so much, and I'm grateful for the people who are willing to help me learn. But it's also like it's really, really hard to be out there and to have so many people following along and having opinions and letting, kind of navigating your own process with also like learning from other people. So what's that like for you? How do you do that?
It's so hard. I'll be honest. As a highly introverted person, I know this typically doesn't come across on that public facing persona of what I share publicly, but I'm very introverted, and my natural inclination when that happens is to retreat. There's not a big part of me that thinks like, oh, I have to keep pressing the issue or digging in. And, in my personal life, I'm that person who still loves to get the last word. But when that happens in this aspect, it's more like, okay, I need to really reflect inward, kind of think about why it is that I feel triggered to this response, or, why I feel so compelled to argue my case or keep this dialogue going. And it's tough because, like you said, there's a lot of people who are following along specifically because of that. And you want to keep it sort of on the front burner. You don't want to let these topics fade to the background because they are so important. We know how important they are. I think, of some of the examples in the past where some messages have been challenged or, I've been called into further discussions and things like that. I think it's just such a good reminder that even when we are considered experts in a certain area or we feel like we have some level of expertise, like the learning is never done. There's always going to be more that we can gain from having these conversations, as uncomfortable as they might seem at the time, and just staying open-minded to the fact that we have this very objective type of learning with facts and statistics and evidence-based practice. But at the same time, we have this very subjective world too, where people are bringing their personal histories and their own opinions and the experiences that have shaped their lives. And I think the challenge for us, kind of sitting in the middle, is how do we blend those two worlds without alienating or discrediting some of the messages, but also keeping that conversation moving along. And it's really tough. I don't think I have very good answers for that, but I also think it's a work in progress. And the best thing that I think I can do at this point is to just stick with it, and practice isn't going to make perfect because, as we know, there's no such thing. But just being more attuned to that and being aware of it is a good place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. So Cara, we've talked a lot about your process and professionally and kind of what it's like to be a strong voice for the health at every size world, or in the health at every size world. So this podcast is mostly geared toward, or I like to talk mostly toward the layperson. And I know that I also have like dietitians and other clinicians who listen. Let's talk a little bit about how a layperson who's discovering intuitive eating or kind of challenging some of the messaging around bodies that they've received in their lives, what would be your advice or thoughts on how the layperson can find their voice and become confident in their own approach to their body, even when other people might be doing other things?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I mean, I like to remind everyone too, even as dietitians, even as certified intuitive eating counselors, if that's your background, I mean, we're people first and foremost. So we've had to work through these challenges as well. And although it's layered into our professional work, that personal work is where it has to start. And I think for the people who are sitting and listening to this and thinking like, wow, I know this to be true, and I really feel like this is the most authentic way to approach my health and wellness, or the way I live, or the way I treat my body. It's so challenging because when you go out into the world, it's immediately contradicted by pretty much everyone. We live in this diet obsessed culture. We're bombarded from all directions with these mixed messages, and it can feel relatively unsafe to challenge that. To be honest, in certain settings, it's going to be a time where maybe you say, it's not my role to educate everyone on this approach, or I just don't have the energy and I need to be mindful of my own personal boundaries in how I approach this. So I think first and foremost, I would just offer that as either permission or encouragement to know what your boundaries are and protect yourself. If you know that getting into a debate about the merits of a non-diet approach with someone who just firmly refuses to be open-minded towards it, maybe that's a time where you take a step back. But as far as finding your voice in general, I think there's a lot of offline or, maybe more personal or private ways to explore that first. And before bringing anything public, that can be a little bit more approachable. I'm kind of thinking of things like, if you have access to working with a group of like-minded people, it doesn't always have to be in that professional sense. It can sometimes even just be a group of friends or family members who are open to that and want to create that safe space and that environment to talk it out and process how this really looks in real life. I think therapy is a wonderful tool, and I'm fully aware that it's not accessible or or not an option for all people. But if it is, I've benefited a lot from it. And I'm glad to see that that's starting to be less stigmatized and more open in conversation. I also think too, looking at what you've posted or shared in the past and almost auditing it in a sense can be helpful, because like I was saying with my writing, I'll look back on things that are even just a couple of years old, and I'll see the places where it no longer aligns with how I feel now. And it doesn't mean that I necessarily have to do anything about it. It's kind of bringing that aspect of mindfulness in, where you just notice and observe how your thoughts and beliefs have changed and shifted. And that can be a really great space for growing and really solidifying how you feel in present day. I've had people who've said, oh, I look back at pictures that I posted or things that I had on social media, or, books that I bought or things that I saved to my Netflix list or whatever the case may be. And that reflection of going back and seeing like how that evolution takes place, I think can be a really positive thing, because you just see how far you've come. And that's one of the things that can be so discouraging with this long process of learning, is that we feel like we're just fighting tooth and nail, but not really getting anywhere. So I think that can be a little bit of lift in this process to just encourage us to keep going and keep working, especially when it feels really, really challenging.
So I'm imagining myself as like a layperson listening, thinking like, okay, how much do I need to speak up about this? How do I know is the difference between a time where it's really skillful and important for me to speak up versus a time where I can just let people be where they are? In the context of finding your voice, I feel like that's an important thing to kind of explore a little bit. How much do you speak up versus, and the layperson might also not be posting a bunch of stuff about this as well. So I'm interested to know what your thoughts are as far as like that internal work of, your voice isn't always necessarily like what you're saying to other people. It can be your own direction, your own sense of what's right for you, even in the midst of diet culture. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, like you said, a lot of this takes place behind the scenes, and these are almost harder. I would actually take that back and say they are harder, because these are people that we have personal histories with, right? Like it's our mother, it's our physician, it's our colleague that we've sat next to for the last however many years. And we have long-standing personal histories that, are reflected in these conversations. So like you said, we don't always have the words or the language to speak to these things. And we might not even have the confidence to say, okay, I can articulate what I know to be true. And I think that's perfectly okay. I still, even now, have moments where you feel your throat get tight, like the words kind of get caught as they're coming out of your mouth, and you just walk away and you're like, oh God, I bombed it. Like I did not do a good job of explaining what I wanted to say. And I think we have to remind ourselves that we can sometimes speak just as loudly by simply saying no to things, or asking that our personal boundaries around these things are respected and honored. So an example of that, might be at a family dinner or a holiday event or some other gathering. This is where diet culture just rears its ugly head over and over. And when we're sick of that and we recognize that that's a toxic environment for our own healing and our own work, I think it can be a really loud message just to say that, I feel triggered by this, or I don't wish to be around this, or, I'm just going to shut this down or take it in another direction, because it still sends a similar message. I won't say it sends the same message as, diving right into things, but it does establish what you will and won't tolerate as far as your personal space that you need for staying committed to a non-diet approach. So, if that's something like practicing some of these phrases that you can just tuck in your back pocket and pull them out whenever you need them, I think that's a subtle way, or perhaps a more approachable way, to advocate for this without necessarily risking your own discomfort at the same degree. I have a hard time with this too, because, at this point, I'm so entrenched and immersed in this non-diet world. It's sometimes easy for me to forget how hard that was in the beginning. And so just offering a lot of compassion too, and saying like, it's okay to say it wrong, or it's okay to have to go back and check your facts, or find a resource, or tag team a friend to come in and offer a little backup, because it is hard. I mean, we see a lot of people who have well-crafted arguments in opposition to a non-diet approach. And if we don't feel prepared to handle that, we sometimes think like, okay, this isn't the time or the place. Like, I don't have everything in my wheelhouse. I'm not prepared. I'm not ready. And that feels scary too. So I've been in those shoes, but at the same time, at this point, it's been a long time since I felt that same level of discomfort. And it's just hard. I'm just offering a lot of compassion to anyone who's attempted that, because I know it's not easy.
It's really hard. And that's something I tell my clients all the time. Like, this is what I do for a living. And when I'm out and about doing my personal life, and somehow these types of topics get brought up, I find it really demoralizing when I get a look of disdain or disgust or confusion when I try to explain what I do for work. And I can only imagine how demoralizing it must feel on another level for the person who's feeling extra vulnerable. Like, this is new stuff for me. This is something I'm working on figuring out. I'm just trying to explain it to you, and here you are making fun of it or questioning it or telling me I'm wrong. I have the privilege of, living in a straight size body, having credentials after my name, also in many ways knowing the words to say. And I still feel that way when I try to explain this message and use my voice, and kind of am met with this opposition. So I just like to kind of throw that out there for anyone who's like, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I explain this to somebody? It really, a lot of times, isn't necessarily you. It's actually just where they might be in their own process, and less about your ability to convince or to not convince. I found that as we try to convince people tend to just put up their wall, and no matter how much sense you make, like, they're just kind of feeling defensive and maybe not super opening to listening as well. So that's another dynamic to keep in mind with using our voice, is it's not necessarily going to work,
Oh, I know. And that's the most frustrating piece, because like you said, we know this to be true. We've got not only our own observations and experiences, but we can remind people, this is an evidence-based approach. We don't have as much research, and the literature is not as robust as weight-centric research has been for a number of reasons. But, we all grow up in diet culture, and we all, to some degree, have internalized, these messages about health and wellness and body shape and size and nutrition and food and all the rest. And so a lot of times it's exactly how you said. It's really more of a reflection of how they've been either benefiting from privilege that they maybe weren't aware of, and they're fearful of losing that on perhaps a conscious or unconscious level. But also, looking at the structures that uphold diet culture, it really is rooted in a lot of societal approaches to how different groups of people are treated. And it's a tough thing, because a lot of times it has very little to do with the food itself, and it has a lot more to do with just the culture that we're all immersed in.
Yeah, on other levels other than diets too, right? Like on racism levels, and on other systemic, like, inequality levels that sometimes, we, meaning people in the non-diet space, like, we talk a lot about how these systems can be really oppressive and really problematic, but it's also important to keep in mind, like, they're part of a larger system that also, like you said so well, like, affects lots of different groups of people, and also upholds certain systems that make some people, less equal than others, which is really, like, a really important. It's important for me to put these types of conversations in context of all of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think the context is what often gets lost, because going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's really difficult to convey all of this within an Instagram post or, a single conversation that you have with someone in their, message inbox. And those things are happening. And I think they're a good way to open the door, but we can't just stop there. Shining a light on these issues isn't necessarily doing the work that's going to start dismantling diet culture or address some of those systemic problems and this institutionalized stigma and bias that we see at the core of diet culture. So I think it's a nice time to remind everyone too that, there's so much going on behind the scenes. And for anyone who's listening and thinking, well, I don't even really have social media or that's not where I spend my time. There's still a ton of work that can be done offline within families and communities and at the policy level that still makes a very necessary contribution towards, where this work is heading. So
if not more, right? Like you're
exactly.
on the ground, whereas like the social media is kind of like, okay, I'm putting this out into the ether and hoping that this translates into action in families and communities and institutions. But you're right, like that's such an important piece that, I think a lot of times people look at someone like you and think, gosh, she's so awesome. She's speaking to so many people. She's writing books. She's got it, and what am I supposed to do to change our culture around food and bodies? And that's a really good point that I think people sometimes miss, like these little tiny, 2-second comment you make it at the dinner table with your family, like, gosh, it's, I love this food. It's so tasty. Or like, just something that might just change up the typical narrative. That's where the action really happens. And I think we meaning this whole movement of people who are trying to create change, like we need each and every person listening, as you feel able and as it feels, right for you in your own situation, to just like little tiny things make a huge difference.
Oh, they really do. I mean, I think back to some of the things that have made the biggest impression on me, and it wasn't, attending a full day workshop or, listening to a 2-hour webinar. I mean, those things are amazing and fantastic in their own right. And they do a lot for continuing sort of that objective type of learning. But the things that are like seared into my memory are just like little comments, like you said, just one little thing that planted a seed and made me think or led me to the next step. And we all have the ability to plant those seeds, even just in passing. I think the tough or frustrating part of that is we just don't know what that outcome is going to be. There's really no good way to follow up on that and see what the result's going to be when you put that out there. But that work is taking place at all levels. And as I was thinking of, sort of where I've landed in my professional work, at this point, I see like a funnel in my mind. And down at the bottom, the really narrow tip of the funnel is where we have those one-on-one interactions. And we have the ability to make a really deep or really lasting impact with maybe one person or one person and their family or their network. And as you go further up the funnel and it gets wider and wider, it can seem like the messages get watered down because they're trying to be more general. You're struggling to be as inclusive as possible while still also conveying what you want to say about a non-diet approach. And the audience gets broader and therefore also more diverse. And where it can be really, really challenging, where this work is happening behind the scenes, is how do you change those messages, or what kind of impact can you have when your work shifts to that level? And I think that's where we might see this movement, going next, is really getting into the places where diet culture is popping up outside of that personal work. Because I think of things like, food companies that are changing their labeling, or, different organizations for health or wellness that have realized, okay, we need a culture shift. And I think that's a huge opportunity because they're mindful of a lot of different stakeholders. They're aware that there are multiple people with different areas of expertise, and you don't necessarily need to have a degree in nutrition or, all of these credentials behind your name to be an expert in that way. So again, for anyone listening, I'd encourage you to get really creative and kind of think like in your own network or in your life or your work, where are the opportunities that you can start to plant those seeds and see where maybe as you trickle up the funnel, where those non-diet messages might still have a place.
Yeah, I love that, Cara. That was such good advice. What's popping up for me is, and I'm always trying to anticipate what listeners might think. They might think, okay, let me look up Cara, let me look up Paige. Okay, I see two women like who occupy like very socially acceptable bodies. So of course you guys can speak up. Like of course that's easy for you. But and I just want to own that yes, there is an element of like that is true. That is true that saying like, hey, all foods can fit, or like, hey, have you ever heard of intuitive eating? Like that might be easier for someone like us to say for a lot of different reasons. And I just wanted to own that. And also, just throw out there like it's not your job to change your family, to change your coworkers' minds about this. And if you don't feel like it's right for you to speak up, that doesn't make you wrong or bad or doing this wrong or unwelcome here or anything like that. I just wanted to throw that in there because I know how it can sometimes people read between the lines and might hear something we didn't intend. So I wanted to speak to it.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you included that as well. I think disclosing that level of privilege and acknowledging that I lack the same experience as people who do live in a different sized body. I even hesitate to put labels on that because again, I'm not always confident that I know what someone else's preferred language is. So in my messaging, I often offer options or leave it blank or open. So if it's like, for example, describing body shape and size, I'll say, as you mentioned earlier, living in a straight size body. That's a very different experience than, I've had clients who've shared that they do prefer the word fat as a neutral descriptor. And I've had others who say they prefer different language, whether that's a larger body, a higher weight body, allowing that ability to reclaim language can be really powerful, but we also can't assume or project that onto people and force it on them to say, well, this is everyone's preferred language and this is what we should be using. So I think that's been a big learning curve for me because again, like you said, my nature is to come across as really really confident and have a lot of conviction about this. But one of the downsides of that approach is that you tend to have blinders on sometimes. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't always get it right. And there are a lot of times where I get it very wrong. And I think owning up to that and disclosing that you're still learning and will inevitably sometimes get it wrong is something else that gives people permission to also get it wrong. Like you were saying, it's not always our job to bring this to light in settings where it might be really challenging to the status quo. And I think having permission to stumble over words or try to work through messaging in different ways, we have to feel like we're able to do that. Otherwise, we might just stop there and throw our hands up and kind of say, why bother? Like, I didn't get it right this time. I'll never do it perfectly. Like, what's the point?
I love that. I love that. And that permission for yourself, like let's take you, Cara, like you modeling that you give yourself permission to make mistakes or to, fumble over words or to say, hey, I'm sorry for the way I worded that I've learned that isn't, what I should be doing or what's going to feel the best for people. Like giving yourself permission to be a little bit messy in this process, I think is like, I would say it's got to be therapeutic in and of itself for people to see like, oh, okay, if she can do that, then I can do that too. Like this is messy and that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm doing it wrong. It just means I'm learning. I have two little girls and watching them learn how to do anything is so much like that, right? It's like they don't, a kid doesn't start trying to learn how to walk and then just say, well, that was hard. I'm not doing that. I didn't do it perfect right away, right? Like it's in their nature to keep going and to expect the messiness of it. I find that super inspiring. And I also find it interesting how we grow older and somehow we start to think we start to assume that we should just get it right the first time, always.
Mhm. Well, and talk about really oppressive structures. I mean, I think just, women having a voice in general, we're kind of taught that we should be a little bit more soft-spoken or demure or apologetic when, our thoughts or opinions aren't well received. And at this point, it's like we can't not say something, to continue with that and, kind of back away from those conversations is one of those things where it's like, what's more uncomfortable, sitting in that discomfort or the anxiety of challenging that, or sitting with the anxiety and discomfort of knowing that if we don't speak up, like it's only going to be more of the same. And I
That's
think one of
huge.
the biggest learnings that I've taken from this non-diet approach is that the dismantling of diet culture truly does benefit everyone in every body, even those who live in very privileged bodies at this point. Because I think when I was first grappling with the concept of thin privilege and understanding how I benefit from it, one of the arguments that I heard when I was processing it in conversation was, well, if thin privilege is really a thing, then once everyone has equal rights, it'll flip and it'll reverse, and fat privilege will become a thing. And that's just one example of how this message can get so twisted so easily. And there's a lot of reasons why that's obviously a very problematic message, and I definitely do not agree or endorse it whatsoever. But I think it's just one of those things where, again, we have to recognize that when we do this work, it does come from a selfish place in a way. And again, I'll be the first to say that because of that privilege that I experience living in the body that I have. But there's also a selfless element to this work where, people who are very active and vocal in this space recognize that they're advocating and in positioning themselves as an ally, not only for themselves, but for the groups that don't have as loud of a voice or who don't have the same platform or who will benefit from this work in the future. So, again, if you're sitting at home listening or you're hearing this and wondering how it might look for you, I think it's also worth mentioning that we're not always the right people to share this message in the first place. And that's where it can be really helpful to have a wider network of people that you can bring in, people who are doing this work, and we can help elevate their platform and amplify their voice. Being cognizant of the fact that even though we might feel really compelled to talk about something, we can't always let our ego get in the way. Like maybe we really aren't the right person to be bringing this up, and someone else can and should be doing this job. So I think that's also another reminder that I often forget, and just talking about it now is a good reminder to myself, and yeah, just to put that out there too.
Cara, that is so well said. And speaking of like finding your authentic voice, like I just have to say, like I really love talking with you. Like I can tell how much time you've spent thinking about this and solidifying this and wrestling with this stuff. It shows in how you're able to convey the message in a really like authentic and true to yourself way. And I mean, it doesn't sound like it's scripted. You know what I mean? Like it's like, this is how I feel. This is what I have learned. This is like from my heart. And I just appreciate that so much. That means a lot.
Oh, thank you. And I guess if there's any introverts listening, maybe you know how that's, but we spend a lot of time in our own heads. I think, just that introspective quality means that, yeah, like when I hear or read something new that's challenging or that I feel triggered by, my gut instinct, like I said, is to kind of retreat and think about it. And, my friends and family will probably tell you too, like there's times where they're just like, okay, wow, like we need to lay this to rest for just a little bit. Like we need to move on. And I'm like, but no, there's still so much to think about. We got to talk this out. We got to get to the bottom of it. And I think patience is just the other thing too. Like this is a long process, and we can get so fired up and invigorated by it. But then also too, we got to step back and like give ourselves that time to rest and process and think about it. So yeah, I spend a lot of time in my own head.
I do too. I do too. So I relate to what you're saying there for sure. So Cara, this has been so fabulous. what am I missing? Is there anything that you want to make sure to say or to add or to summarize? How are we doing with talking about this topic?
Yeah, it's so hard because like you said, these conversations go off on tangents and you could just talk about it for days and for hours. But I mean, I just love giving shout outs too to some of the people who I think are also doing really, really interesting and important work. So
Go for
like
it.
right now, I know this episode is coming out a little later in the year, but in my world, I just returned from a workshop where a non-diet approach was the entire focus of the workshop. And we did a lot of dialogue and role playing and kind of modeling of what this looks like in real life. And one of the people that I thought did a fantastic job with that, who is absolutely worth checking out and following, is Bree Campos. And she is on Instagram as Body Image with Bree. But I think one of the adjacent challenges to intuitive eating and a non-diet approach is some of that body image work. And I know, at least for me at this point in time, that really highlighted some of the areas where I myself need to do a little bit more work on that, and reminding people that, you know, if it feels challenging or difficult to get into some of the other non-diet work or the Hays aligned work, there's still some other adjacent areas where you could still get started. So lately I've been reminding people too that body image has to go hand in hand with some of this, and maybe you start with one and then discover the other, or maybe there's parts that you're working on simultaneously. But that's another big area of healing that I've seen a lot of benefit from, and working with other people as well. I think that's really worth highlighting.
That's great. And I love Bree too. She's so wonderful, so smart.
Yes, there's so many people out there who are doing amazing work just like her. So it's certainly not to diminish or minimize what others are doing. She just happens to be the one that I'm thinking about because I just spent time with her in New York City, and her session was amazing. I mean, talk about someone who speaks with so much conviction and really gets you going. I mean, her presentation was fantastic.
That's so cool. I need to get her on the podcast. I've thought of that. I need to make it happen. She's great. Well, Cara, will you take a minute and talk about how people can keep in touch with you and follow along with your work?
Absolutely. I'd love to. So, of course, we've talked about social media. You can find me mostly on Instagram these days. I'm at streetsmart.rd. And then my website at this point is streetsmartnutrition.com. Had a few changes along the way. You'll find me also on Facebook and Twitter, and I also have some writing projects. So one thing that's a little bit new for me this year is exploring what it's like to write on Medium. And so if anyone's not familiar with Medium, this is a kind of open source digital publication in a sense, where some of the topics that maybe aren't a good fit for my website or social media have ended up on there. And there's a lot of interesting writers who are talking about some of these things that we've talked about today. So whether that's, you know, feminism or some of those topics around stigma and bias, body image, health and wellness, you know, relationships. There's a lot of really interesting writing taking place on there. And so I've started to dabble in that world a little bit as well.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Cara, so much for joining me. This has been really, really fabulous conversation. And thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Yes, I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to share, and I can't wait to hear some of your future episodes too.